come on. Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to the legislative wrap-up session, and we are affectionately calling this lemonade with our legislators. So if you haven't had a chance to get some lemonade or a beverage in the back or a cookie, please do so. I want to let you know that we will be broadcasting this live, and if you'd like to watch it on playback, you certainly can do that on the Government Access channel or on our Facebook page, the City of Ottawa's Facebook page. We have a few ground rules that we want to set forward with you guys, and most of them are not new to you since many of you have been at legislative coffees before. We ask that every individual only ask one question at a time. Please don't load your question with 15 different sub-questions. Ask one question, please. Please hold your applause to allow for any additional questions or follow-up questions that may need to happen. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will get to you just as soon as possible. But no statements are allowed, so we're not going to allow you just to stand up and just tell us what you think. Please have it in the form of a question. We ask you to please turn your cell phones off or turn it to a mode in which that we cannot hear it during this hour that we spend time together. I do want to begin this legislative lemonade with asking you all to think about the individual who usually serves in this role, and that's Richard Jackson, and he is unable to be here because he is under the weather, so please keep him in your thoughts, and I know if he can return, he will do so as soon as he can. I do want to introduce my co-moderator today, and that is Brett Stanislow, and he is going to go over a few additional things regarding this lemonade.
Thank you, Sarah. First, we just want to start off with thanking our sponsors, the Ottawa Area Chamber of Commerce and the Legislative Action Committee, Franklin County Farm Bureau Association, and the American Legion Post number 60. We have got a few other thank yous too, the Ottawa Area Young Professionals for helping moderate and bringing the refreshments, and the City of Ottawa, of course, for the facility and providing us with the coffee, and Matt Simonson back there for filming this and making sure that we get it put up on the Government Access channel. One other announcement not related, Friday morning, June 30th at 8 a.m., we'll have a ribbon cutting for the Health Partnership Clinic at 107 South Main Street.
Thank you, Brett. We are going to begin with a question that I have for each one of our legislative members, and it's a three-part question. We do have, and I hope that you had a chance to pick up some general questions that we may or may not ask during this session. How we're going to proceed is I have a question, Brett has a question, and then we're going to send it out to you, and you can ask your questions. So, our legislators, three things that I need to know. Three things that your constituents need to know about this session. Two things that didn't receive a whole lot of media coverage, but that you think your citizens or constituents need to know. And one thing that you thought was the best or worst part about this session. Senator Tyson, would you like to begin?
Yeah, would you repeat those again?
Sure.
Three things.
Three things that your constituents must know about this session.
Okay.
Two things that maybe didn't receive much media coverage, but you think that it's important that citizens or your constituents need to know about, or that it would affect your citizens or constituents.
Okay.
And then number one, or one thing that is the best or worst thing about this session.
Okay. Well,
and introduce yourself.
I will. I'm glad to be here. Good afternoon. I'm used to good morning, and I'm not used to this outfit in the afternoon these days. We're usually fixing fence and moving cows, and we're chasing a bull these days. But life's good. I'm glad to be back on the ranch. You know, this session, three things that you need to know are budget, tax, and education. Those were the three main issues this year. Most of you kept up with what went on with it. You're very aware of what passed. We passed a budget that is interesting. It spends more than what we're going to bring in if estimates hold in 2020. So we have the biggest tax increase that we've passed in the state, $500 million or $600 million, depending on which year you're looking at. And then by 2020, The books won't balance. We'll be in the red again, not in the black. So that's important to know. Another thing that is very important to know is we passed the education funding bill. There's a lot in it that's good, but there are some things in it that could have been addressed that should have been addressed. One of the items most of you may not know that need to know, we're paying approximately $13 to $18 million for out-of-state students, Kansas taxpayers, and that was not addressed in this education funding bill. So the third thing I would say that's most important is, and you may already know this, our constituents, I would say that, you know, we're a part-time legislature. We're up there approximately 90 days. This session did run over. But every other year, we're there 90 days by Constitution, by the state Constitution. What we need to know is that we need legislators that are willing to work on this in their spare time. And I know that asks a lot of the legislature, but if we go up there January and start working on a multi-billion-dollar budget for K through 12 funding, how good is that equation going to be? Especially when we have leadership that pushes it off in one chamber, let the House work on it for months, and then the Senate starts working at it in the final veto session. So you're not going to get the best possible legislation, and I think you should know that. I think that it's disappointing when we don't spend the time necessary on getting the best possible legislation for our constituents. As far as the tax bill goes, you know, it's a major tax increase. I've said it here, I've said it before. We still need change to our Kansas tax structure. This is not a perfect solution by any means. But one of the issues with that tax bill was our district, the 12th Senate District, for those of you that are not familiar with it, it encompasses almost 6 counties: Anderson, Allen, Franklin, Lynn, Bourbon, Miami. Those individuals that live in that district that I represent, and myself, most of us are middle income to low income individuals. So we're putting the largest tax burden ever that passes the state of Kansas on these individuals. There were tax proposals that would not have done this. We had one tax proposal that would have increased the standard deduction to meet the federal deductions. That would have helped your lowest income individuals to pay less taxes. Why wouldn't we consider that type of legislation? I fought very hard for that and was not able to get it passed. I did get some other things done, though, that I was very thankful for. One of it was the tax bill. It was retroactive. It starts January 1st, 2017, which you may or may not have heard. Nobody was looking at the fact that if you wouldn't have paid your quarterlies as a business, you would have had to pay penalties on that. I was able to bring that to the legislature's attention and able to get it passed so that if you do not make your quarterlies for 2017 tax, you will not have a penalty this year. Now, you'll have to start your quarterlies again in 18, but at least it addressed the fact of retro. And you know, it considers the individual taxpayer, people that are trying to make a living check to check. So there were other things too, and I'll discuss them later as we go. I'm sorry, it was a busy session and I've got a lot to tell. So thank you.
So I think we missed you on, tell me about a couple things that didn't get much media coverage, but the citizens need to know about.
Well, I would think the 18 million for out-of-state students didn't get much media coverage. The tax penalties, the retro not having to pay any penalties for 2017, that didn't get much media coverage. The other thing is the, well, there were several. But
What's the best or the worst thing that happened this session?
The best or the worst? The best, I would say, is, well, I had several successes as far as myself. Some of the items that I talked about, a couple of them, one of them that I did not talk about and is very close and impacts most of us, is we were able to increase the number of beds at Osawatomie State Hospital to 20 beds. It will be going up by 20 beds this year. So I'm very thankful for that, and that did not get hardly any press at all. I worked diligently on that. Another issue I worked hard on and we were able to get past was we were able to delay implementation of some small business regulations that are going on. Scrap metal dealers, they have to pay $1,000 a year, fingerprinted items that was going to cut them out, put them out of business. We were able to get that delayed for a year so that we can work with industry and the dealers to come up with proper legislation. The other, there were just quite a few things this year. That was probably, I personally had a successful year. I would say overall, with every legislative session, there's good and there's bad. Like I said, we did have some poor legislation that passed. Hopefully we can come back next year and address it.
Thank you. Representative Jones?
Yes, ma'am. Loaded question. First of all, I just want to appreciate everybody who's here. Obviously, the sponsors. This is awesome. I didn't know what to expect at 4 o'clock lemonade, and I, for some reason, had one of the hottest drives ever. My little car just didn't cool itself off, and so 96 degrees on one and 92 on the other. But anyway, and my wife started up the air conditioner again. It's been nice. Anyway, so 3 things that you need to know, and I'm going to just maybe more insightful stuff. For instance, one of the first tax votes we took in the House, it was real clear kind of the makeup of the actual House. And I think all of us would agree, sometimes until your first votes actually happen, you don't know where people are going to land. We had a lot of new people in the House and whatnot. So we really found the split in the House, on the House side of things, to be almost 40-40-40. It was 33%, 33%, 3%. Conservative, middle, moderate, or liberal or Democrat. And so it was split real even. That's probably the first thing you need to know if you didn't already know that already. But and I'll just say from that, it makes it really hard to come up with an answer. Just plain and simple. It makes it really hard to come up with an answer. I might have a real conservative idea, and I float it out there, and guess what? It can't get the votes. And we might have a more liberal idea, float it out there, can't get the votes. And that's where when we talk about the long session or anything like that, that's really what makes it difficult. So whether it's the school, the education, as our senator talked about, education, tax, or budget, it's going to be really. So I'll be completely honest. Early on, I was like, how in the world are we going to get out of here? That's just the question I had, because I looked at it after some of these votes and I'm like, I just don't know how we're going to get out of here. And this is what we're wrestling with as the Kansas Congress. This is what we're wrestling with, trying to find what is going to. So I think that if the 3 things, the 40-40 didn't have an answer, and then during the actual veto override, and I'm just going to the final tax vote where we got a veto override and it actually passed. And I was looking over the shoulder of our speaker. Ron Reichman came and he was speaking to me about it and talking to me about this and that. And is most everybody you have a pretty good understanding how that all went down? Because yeah, I see some nods. Essentially, whenever you go or you're doing a veto override, first of all, it's already passed out of the House, passed out of the Senate, goes to the governor, he vetoes it, and then it has to be overridden if we're going to actually override what the governor has said in this case. And you have to have the 2/3, so you have to have at least 84, and I think it ended up being like 87 or 88. But that being said, he was talking to me, a couple other people were talking to me, and I didn't see the numbers. I just didn't see us getting there. And ultimately, and I'm just going to this, because we did override the veto, the Senate did override the veto, that tax policy became law. The reason I say that is, like it or not, that is the answer at this time for our state. It just is. It's retroactive. There's lots of bad things about it I don't like, but that's the answer. So we are not still in Topeka, which honestly, some days I thought maybe we would still be there, because you're wrestling and you're trying to get people to work together. So we have a lot of folks that I saw their votes and I'm like, what in the world are they doing? I couldn't conceive it. But like it or not, that's what the answer is at this time. So it's incredible increase in tax. Anyway, I'll stop with, that's the three things you need to know. Two things that didn't get as much media attention. I think a lot of the details about that simple fact, the 40-40-40, the real split in the House and ideology. Something that you wouldn't know is that many of the people that were in the House, colleagues of mine now in the Senate, they got burned, got burned. I say burned on the edges. Conservatives got burned, liberals got burned a little bit, so nobody was willing to what's the word? It's hard for me to say. The C word where you work together. Thank you. But it's true. It's very difficult for those folks when you're burned on the edges and you've compromised before and then it comes back and bites you. It's hard. So those things don't get a lot of media attention because we just look at the big picture and say, we raised taxes, it's retroactive, or it's not enough to meet the budget. Then we have budget there's lots of new spending. There's opposing budgets that could have possibly worked and things like that. So they just don't get as much media attention. The thing that's best or worst, I would say, having sat on the K through 12 budget committee and doing the new funding formula, I would say best or worst is probably the new funding formula. And the reason I say best or worst is it's not best for me, and it's not worse for me. Not that. Here's why. Okay, one of my major intentions with the funding formula is to come up with something that's going to, first of all, work, and secondly, is not going to have us in litigation. And it's not going. It doesn't put the courts on the spot to actually make those decisions, and then we're just back in court again. But with what we have, which a lot of it, although we did do a lot of the things that the court asked, we hope, even our legal representation said we'll probably be sued again within 2 years. And I think I already heard that we'll probably be sued again even quicker than that. So that is really the best and worst thing all in one. So I'll stop with that and appreciate your questions.
Thank you, Representative Jones. Representative Finch.
Well, I want to echo the thanks to all of you for coming out today. Normally we're here on Saturday morning. I see we still have church seating. Everybody's at the back. There are open seats up front if anybody comes in late and wants to have a seat. It's good to know that works on Wednesday afternoon as well as Saturday and Sunday morning. I would echo also the comment about probably the three things you need to know about tax, budget, and school finance are kind of the big three that come down the pike. I will say that, in terms of taxation, nobody likes voting for a tax increase. You also have to admit that there has been nothing conservative about the Kansas budget situation over the last 4 years. We have depleted our reserves, we have financed operations on the credit card, and we have seen our bond rating trashed by objective outside parties. That's not conservative fiscal management. That's not Republican financial governance. And so something had to be done. And we can debate all day long about the specifics of the plan and who liked what and whether it's a good idea, bad idea, but the reality is something had to be done, a reset button had to be pressed so that we can move forward with some real, sound, common sense fiscal governance for the future. That doesn't mean we blow the budget and we spend a bunch of money. It doesn't mean we raise a bunch of taxes. It says, okay, here's a reset. We can pay our bills. Now let's figure out how we go forward and actually have sound fiscal management that doesn't compromise the future and doesn't raise spending and taxes to a level that's not sustainable. On budget, what you're going to hear a lot of people, the soundbite is, the budget is blown up and it's a huge increase in spending. Take K-12 out of it because that's to respond to a court order, and it's 1.6% increase in spending over the prior year. Since 2012, we've seen an increase of about 0.3% in state spending out of the general fund. We have not spent a lot of money. The problem is we didn't see spending cuts happen as revenue went down. And so we spent the reserves, KDOT bonding was increased, and that money was used for operations. So this is not some budget-blowing legislative session where people dumped a bunch of money in. And I want to tell you the three biggest cost drivers for that budget: Medicaid, up $120 million. The Capers payment, which if we don't re-amortize it, will grow to $1 billion a year. That's 1/6 of the state general fund will be spent on public employment retirement. That is not sustainable long-term. We simply can't do that. And the other would be HCBS or Human Services caseloads. Those are the three big drivers in the budget this year that cause things to go up. K-12 was another, over the next 2 years, $485 million. If you want to factor in that increase, it's a 4.7% increase in fiscal year 18 over what we had in fiscal year 17. But I believe when you're responding to a court order like that, it's not really fair to say that was a discretionary choice the legislature made to increase that funding. So discretionary spending, for all of those things I just mentioned, 1.6% increase. Not exactly as large as it's being portrayed. Finally, on the school finance, we did the block grant thing 2 years ago, and leadership in both chambers was negligent in pulling a committee together to talk about a new school funding formula. And we ended up with something that looks a lot like the old formula. The good news of that is that if you like the old formula, you got most of it back. If you didn't like the old formula, I'm sorry, but nobody else wanted to step up over the last 2 years and work on that. What we did see is an increase in the at-risk weighting, which is where the court told us to put money to focus on at-risk. We also saw some definitional changes to at-risk, so it's not just school lunch, because there have been concerns in the past about whether or not that's an accurate barometer of which students are at risk. So we did see some changes there, which are good. And I think overall, the work of the K-12 committee that Representative Jones was on did a good job in trying to move the ball forward and make improvements to the old formula while still addressing the concerns raised by the court. And I, for one, believe the court will find the formula to be adequate. I think there's a question of whether they will think enough money has been put in, but we'll see. $485 million over 2 years is one heck of a good faith effort to try to meet what the court has told us to do. Two things that didn't get reported. I'm going to give you a bonus here. I'm going to give you three. The 1.6% increase is an important fact that's going to be overblown by a lot of people, and folks need to know the truth on that. They also need to know that we had our first on-the-floor budget debate in the House in about 4 years. We opened it up, and representatives could bring amendments. Anybody could bring an amendment. Want to guess how many amendments there were to cut spending?
0.
One. Guess who brought it? A Democrat. So for all the talk about Kansas has a spending problem, ask those people to show you the amendments they brought to make cuts to the budget. Because in the House of Representatives, they didn't happen. And it was a cut to the Secretary of State's budget, by the way, about $80,000. So not a lot, kind of a whisper on a whirlwind, if you will, in terms of a $6 billion general fund. So when people tell you there's a spending problem in the state of Kansas and they're asking you for your vote, you might ask them, well, what amendments did you bring to the budget? That didn't get reported much. And finally, the thing I'll tell you didn't get reported much is there were some real efforts behind the scenes to keep this tax increase from being even larger. And if you don't like this tax vote, I understand that, but I'm going to tell you that it could have been far worse in terms of a bigger tax increase without fixing some of the mistakes that were made over the last several years. There were plans that went full repeal that would have been almost another 0.7% on the top bracket. There were plans that did nothing to the sales tax that had been raised in 2015. There were plans that didn't have all the deductions back in there for taxpayers. One of the things that I was working on with the Speaker of the House and several in the Republican Party was how do we have a plan that gets enough revenue to get by, but still leaves us room if we need to comply with a further court order on education. And we had the votes lined up for that. And at the 11th hour, the governor said he would veto it. Well, as Representative Jones said, when you've got a third in the House and you're looking at overriding a veto, you simply can't do it with people who don't want tax increases. You've got to have a couple of different groups come together, and that plan was simply not one that we could get broad-based support for at that point when the governor indicated he would not support it. That was a two-tier plan that would have raised a little less money, but would have also been combined with some spending changes and some sales tax broadening to help broaden the base and lower rates. And when he indicated that he would not support it, we had no choice but to try to keep this from going even farther towards a bill that would put more tax burden on the state of Kansas, and that's what we did. Probably the best thing that happened, as someone here who voted for the budget, I can tell you we've got money for Osawatomie, and not only the 20 beds, but some money for operations. I think the total we had on Osawatomie this time around was 4.7 on the 20 beds, 4.7 million, and about 6.6 million for operations at Osawatomie, which is going to be very helpful. There's also money in the budget to look at an RFP for the addition of a 100-bed facility over there. Much of what they have is antiquated. Part of the problem is keeping up with new federal mandates on those facilities and not having the facilities that we can actually retrofit to do that in a cost-effective way. And the other thing that I'm very proud of is that we had $13.2 million placed into community mental health centers around this state. And so if you talk to anybody from Elizabeth Layton or you talk to Chief Dennis Butler, there was a time last year we had 3 armed standoffs in the span of one weekend. And we talk about how those things are a function of mental health and that we have to spend money on mental health to increase public safety and take care of people. And this budget did that. And so I think that's one of the best things we did so that each and every one of us are safer. I know when we had one out here on the rail trail last year, my daughter was driving by and she called me and asked what was going on. And I thank God that in that case there was not a firearm involved with that person. But you think about how heavily traveled Princeton Road is out on the south end of town and how at risk all of us are when people who need necessary services don't get them, and how important it is that we make those available in a timely fashion. So I'm proud of that. I think that's one of the best things that happened this year, and I got a whole lot of other things we can talk about, but I want to hear your questions, so I'll stop talking now. Thank you.
So for the next question, we'll truncate it a little bit. If you grabbed a handout, I'm asking part of question 2, and that way we'll get to questions from you guys. Going further on education in Senate Bill 19, most importantly, I want to ask if you view it as a positive or negative for education funding in the state of Kansas, and whether or not you supported it, as well as why. Ms. Tyson?
As with any legislation, there's good and bad. There were some good things in it. But the major issue that I saw with this legislation was that it shifted the money amount to the urban schools. In fact, perhaps so much so that we've lost some of our, the ground that we had gained in the equity funding. We may have lost some of that. All of the schools saw an increase because we did increase the funding, as you heard, a decent amount. But my concern is this area, you know, the schools, and we know that our schools are going to get more money, but my concern was the way the equation was written. It favored urban schools, and so we have to look to the future, not just the dollar amount for what we're going to get this year with this bill. We need an equation that supports our students and our needs, and so that was one of my big concerns. Another one, as I said, was the out-of-state students. When we're paying, the Kansas Department of Education estimated between $13 and $18 million for students coming across the state line to attend our K through 12 schools. Our taxpayers are funding those. So, you know, there's items like that that we could have addressed in the education bill that we didn't. But for the most part, it, you know, there was good and bad, but I had to protect the district and our rural schools.
Sure. So just to be clear, on supporting or opposing, it sounds like you were kind of mixed,
no.
but
Yes.
you voted no.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
I also voted no on it. And I also agree there's goods and bads. In committee, as we went, and this was a really long process, and I have to also give props to our chairman, Representative Campbell, to be able to balance it and work with a number of different groups and people to be able to at least get something, because we had to have something. And so, and maybe this is another thing that not a lot of people know. When you're doing amendment after amendment after amendment, or bill after bill after bill, and there was people that worked for the last 2 years on coming up with ideas for a funding formula, or ideas that could be pieces of a funding formula, because ultimately what it all comes down to is it's going to be pieces. They're, like it or not, you're going to have amendments that are placed in and taken out. So there was some the real worry is accountability. Ultimately, having accountability, actually accomplishing what you're trying to do with your schools, having outcomes that are, we want the best educated kids. We want the best kids and brightest kids coming out of our schools. We want the best education for them specifically. I think the state school board is moving in that direction with vision. So that being said, in committee, there was a lot of ideas that just got ruled close. I'm talking 9 to 7, 9 to 7, 9 to 7. So a lot of stuff was worked, a lot of stuff was, and we talked about the out-of-state students, and we talked about what the courts wanted when it came to at-risk and more money going to at-risk. We talked about funding it through, I was asking about just the numbers in my own school on kids that get free lunches. We measure stuff a certain way, and is that the right way to measure it? Very difficult questions, but how else do you do it? And so we still need more accountability. Is what I feel like. There was many possible opportunities that we passed on that would have held more accountable. And so I essentially, overall, like I said before, we needed something, but ultimately, I feel like going back to what we've had, I don't want to be in the same cycle of litigation. I just don't want to be there. I don't think it's right for our state, and I don't think it's right for our future. Ultimately, when it comes to more money into the actual formula, we're answering what we think is right, but it would be nice to have the definite and just go with it and then move on from there. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Mr. Finch, same to you.
I voted for Senate Bill 19 when it was in the House. I think the work of the committee took a great deal of time and effort on part of everyone who was on there, whatever their ideological viewpoint, and the idea of sending it back to the committee and seeing what they came up with and tried to find the main channel of where the House was would have been, we would have still been in Topeka. What they produced with a lot of those close votes was a formula that got broad-based support. There are problems with it, absolutely. Nothing of that complexity, nothing that spends half of the state budget is going to be great all the time. So there are issues with it. That C word that was mentioned earlier, I mean, that's part of the process. You don't get everything you want. The other side doesn't get everything they want. But we find something that works for the state of Kansas, and I believe this formula will work for the state of Kansas and does address the issues that were raised in the court's decision. Those out-of-state students were mentioned. That's something that came up on the House side. The reality is you either bar those kids from coming to Kansas schools, and it may be that they're closer to a Kansas school than they are to a Colorado school if they live out on the border, and that's an option. But as long as they're coming to Kansas schools, Kansas made the decision that we're going to put money into those districts. They're not paid to the kids. The money's paid to the district. So unless you're going to bar them from coming, there's going to be a cost to the district to educate them. And so nobody seemed to be willing to go ahead and step up and ban them from coming across state lines to go to school. So that was the decision that was made this year. The real test will be in what happens with the court. I think I agree with Representative Jones. We've got to do something at some point to address the cycle of litigation with school funding in Kansas. Every 8 years, we tend to have a cycle of litigation. We end up in court. And it's because the way Article 6 of the Constitution is drafted, it's the one provision that creates a duty on government to do something. Almost every other time you see in the Constitution, it's a prohibition against government doing something. Shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Shall not quarter troops in your house. Or it's something how government works. It's a procedural issue in the Constitution. You'll have so many representatives, so many senators. This little provision in Article 6, it creates a duty on the state government to make suitable provision for the educational interests of the state is different. It's unique from all those other provisions. And because of that, it spawned a lot of litigation. And we do have to find a way to get off that carousel and find a way that we can go forward sustainably to fund K-12 education in the state without resort to litigation every 8 years. Because I ultimately don't think that's helpful, and I don't think threats of school closure in 2005 and again this year are helpful to our students. And I hope that we can dedicate some time to doing that. As Senator Tyson said, it's a citizen legislature. We're there for about 90 days, unless it's this year or 2015, we're there 114 days. But can you imagine taking on a $3 billion problem with 165 people with as many diverse viewpoints as we had and solving that, or trying to solve that, in 114 days? I mean, it is amazing that the system our founders created works as well as it does, and that we came to some conclusion that with it a majority could support. But we do need to do something different and devote the time to it, whether that's interim committees, whether that's a K-12 committee that's
but the Senate Education Chair made us aware that there are school districts in the state of Kansas that set money aside for lawsuits, some up to 50%, 50 cents per student in their school district. So this cycle will continue as long as we have that going on.
Matt, just one tiny thing. Also, it's something, and this is just not known. It was actually the K-12 budget was passed out of committee without recommendation, which essentially means that we didn't know if it could actually get out of committee. And so, but at the same time, so you know what that means. It just goes to the larger committee so they can make the changes, which we did. There was a lot of changes made and a lot of things. So, something you might have not known.
Okay, now it's time for questions from the audience. I want to remind you, just one question per person, and you must ask a question, not just a statement. Who'd like to be the first question? Almeida. Hold on, Almeida. Let's get you on there.
Almeida Edwards. I'll kind of go back to what started this really bad situation. Is the Governor Brownback tax economic growth plan, is that dead and lying in the grave like John Brown's body, or is it only fragmented at this point? His elimination of certain taxes and so forth.
I think that in the old song, John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. Yes, moldering. If you want to look at pieces of that 2012 tax policy, the pass-through income exemption, it's called the LLC exemption, has been repealed. The glide path to zero, that is targeted, if growth occurs, then rates are cut further, has been eliminated. And the notion of less brackets from 3 to 2 has obviously been reversed with this tax plan that passed. It goes back to 3 brackets instead of 2. So if those, depending on how you define that achievement, but that's kind of the session, everybody said those are kind of the 3 characteristics of the tax plan we've had since 2012. Those 3 things have all been changed at this point in terms of this reset.
Yeah, and one of the most disappointing items that happened this session was we had tax bills that we were debating, and there were senators that were going to vote for the bill until they heard the governor was for the bill. I don't base my decision on what the governor says or doesn't say. I don't think I should. I think a legislator should look at their district and what they ran on and campaigned on. You shouldn't make it about what somebody says about a bill, what's good in the bill. The items was there were 4 things that I fought for in a tax bill this year, and it was that the standard deductions be increased, that we lower sales tax on food, or even I put down a ratchet down so that we could actually get to 0 on sales tax on food. We were able to get that out of the Senate committee. We weren't able to ever get it across the floor. But and it wasn't a drastic increase. If the revenue went up $50 million one year, then we would lower it by 0.2% the next year until we got to 0 on sales tax on food. It was a reasonable philosophy. The other 2 things though that I was able to get in, besides some of the other things I was able to get accomplished in the tax bill, you can now take your medical deductions in the state of Kansas. You could not take your medical deductions since the 2012 tax bill. That is something that is so needed by individuals. That's one of the biggest things that will bankrupt a family is medical expenses. So why shouldn't we be able to take those deductions? We were able to get that in the tax bill and it passed. The other item was your losses, your Schedule F, C, and E losses. If you're a small business and you're trying to start up or you run into some hardship and you have losses, since 2012 in Kansas, you had to add that back and pay state income tax on that loss. So that was a huge victory in my book. I have been fighting for that since 2013. So yes, there were some bad things in the tax bill, but we did have a few wins, a few key wins. I just felt like that the overall bill itself, we could have gotten the deductions, we could have got a few other things if we would have just stuck to it and held our ground. But that didn't happen. People were tired. They wanted to go home. Spouses were sick. I had a senator next to me that has extreme health care problems, and he forego his health care to be there on the Senate floor to vote and to be in the debate, literally putting his life in jeopardy. So there are sacrifices that legislators make to be up there, and I'm glad. We've got a good group of people, and we worked hard this session.
Yeah, it's gone.
Okay. Any additional questions?
Sounds like we got one outside in the hall.
I have to hold the mic. They say I have to hold the mic, so or we have to go at it, or whatever.
My question is not related to anything you did this year. I just need to know a couple of things. One, a year ago in the 2016 legislature, there was a resolution for a constitutional convention that passed in the House 77 to 30-something. I want to know how those of you in the House voted for that. That's the first half of what I want to know.
Okay.
Two of you. I don't believe there was a bill in the Senate.
The Senate did not have it.
Okay, so I need to know how you two voted on
For the
that in last year's.
Convention of the States.
There's a resolution.
Constitution, yeah, it's a resolution. I voted for it.
Yeah, I voted yes on that.
You voted yes on it. Was there such a resolution entered or submitted this year for that?
It didn't get out of committee in the House.
No.
Okay.
Or the Senate.
Yeah.
Additional questions? All right, come on up, Darren. I'll meet you halfway.
When was the last time any of you attended legislative training sessions or other meetings hosted by the Koch-sponsored organization ALEC? And if you attended, who funded your membership and paid your expenses?
We'd like to start.
I went to ALEC a couple years ago, and I know it was on, well, I can't remember if I paid for it or not, but I think it was on scholarship. I'll just say it was on scholarship because I think it was. So, and that scholarship, I assume, comes through House. So, and there, and with that, like with ALEC, and ALEC, my understanding, maybe when I first went to ALEC, I didn't understand everything about it. One thing I didn't understand is that, like, there's moral issues, money issues, business, and all that kind of stuff. And ALEC has changed a lot, and they don't have I don't know if they do any moral issues anymore at all, mainly focused on money type of stuff. There's a lot of other opportunities for folks to go to also that are good too. But I think they're Coke-sponsored, aren't they?
I've not been to any ALEC meetings.
I've not been to any ALEC, and I have not traveled on the to any of those state organizations that are out there, not just ALEC, but the other ones also. I feel like as a legislature, I will, in fact, the Senate did have amendments to try to cut the budget, and your senator carried them. One of them, we spent over $30 million last year on travel, state employees, and legislators included. And I know that is an exorbitant number. $3.7 million of that travel was international. I mean, surely there's some savings there. So that's where I stand. I know the question was about ALEC, but I did try to run amendments on the Senate floor. In fact, I got thanked from the Democrats and the Republicans for my effort on tax and budget this year.
Add a little bit.
Yeah.
I want to point out we're not trying to be mic hogs. We had trouble with spare mics. That's why we're trying to be so possessive on this one.
Hello. I wanted to know, I was concerned about funding for the schools, and I think there's a tax credit given to people. That's right off the bottom line, the whole amount of money for homeschooling. So is that not right? That's not.
Somewhat.
Could you explain it to me, what is?
Yes, there's a tax credit program for businesses, and it's capped at $10 million. I don't know if it passed. There was some talk about personal. I don't think it passed to allow personal.
It did.
It did pass to allow personal gifts also, but it is capped at $10 million. I'm not sure how that program works. It was incentive, and I saw a special on PBS the other day. I think it was PBS. Yes, a conservative does watch PBS and listens to NPR. And it was very interesting because they had a student on that wouldn't have qualified for private school. It was because these are low-income individuals that would not be able to go to private schools. So it was from the mother's perspective of how it had changed her child's life. I thought it was quite interesting. But yes, the program did stay in. It is capped at $10 million. It is a tax credit. I think it's 70%, so you get 70% tax credit for whatever the donation is. No, businesses and individuals. It did open up to individuals. I'm not sure how revenue, you have to apply for it, for the credit, and it's first come, first serve. And last year, I think it was $1.4 million that was actually used in the program.
It wasn't even that much. It was about $700,000 last year. So this has been $10 million for about the last 3 years. It is still $10 million is the total cap. That's the availability of all credits for this program in the state. What was changed this year is that if you have an individual income tax liability and you want to buy some of those credits, you can. So is it an expansion? I'll leave that for you to decide, but the cap has not been lifted at all, and they're not even using $1 million of those credits at this point. Because the biggest donor so far has been AT&T.
Yeah, and I think it was 1.4 over the 3 years of the program.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah.
We do have some people here in Franklin County that are using it, by the way. Send their children to Sacred Heart. I think we have 5 in the county that make use of that program.
And the other thing, and like you mentioned, homeschool, it's not homeschool, and I don't know that homeschool would want that necessarily. It's more private, and it's getting a student. I know a school down in Wichita that uses it, and they brought people up, or some of the students up, and we're talking about it too. It's matching a student who's not thriving necessarily at a certain school, and matching them to a school essentially that, and helping fund them in that school. And the ones that we saw are doing really well, like exponentially better than what they were doing. But there's a lot of factors that go into that. But ultimately, yeah, that's what it was for. It's not for, you can't just go homeschool and get a credit for that. It's focused on those private schools.
Just briefly,
and I think they're accredited too.
The last thing I'll say on that is that there was a committee compromise on the K-12 budget committee that came out as part of the Senate Bill 19, the education bill. And in a debate on the floor about this provision, it was a Democrat who came forward and supported the provision and said, this represents the committee compromise, we should stay with this. And that argument ultimately carried the day, along with several others. So this was part of a broader compromise to get the education package through.
The cap's always been
The cap's always been there. Allowing individuals to take advantage of the credits, too, was the part of the compromise.
All right. Next question.
So on follow-up to that question, if this is a tax credit, how is that impacting then the money to public schools if money is being diverted to private schools, or?
It doesn't. It's not out of this K through 12 funding. K through 12 funding was the same regardless whether that 10 million credit.
A purchase credit does not reduce the amount of K-12 funding. It comes out of the rest of the general fund. So it does not affect K-12 spending at all.
Additional question?
I'll move over.
Let's meet halfway.
Okay. Anytime, Mayor. My question is, with the budget and the tax change and all that took place, have we restored the fuel tax to its intended purpose so that we can drop the bank of DOT and get back to funding what really needs to be funded is our highway improvements and repairs that need to be done to our roads?
Well, this year that's another reason to be disappointed with the budget. It took money from KDOT again, and it delayed Capers payments. It did all the things that they have been complaining about, for the last couple years, which shouldn't have been done, and I have not supported in the past and would not support this year. You know, the sales tax, as far as that goes, there were no changes as to where that money is being directed at this point. So there was talk of increasing a fuel tax for funding for KDOT. There was one item that was passed in the budget that allows KDOT to increase their bonding debt. You know, there's just so many reasons not to. But again, you know, we had to pass a budget too. One thing that I was happy about, I worked to the employee raises. I worked to make sure that the employees that have been here for longer amounts of time, you know, not across the board cuts or employee raises, that they were more targeted. So individuals that have been there 5 years and more will get a 5% raise, while others will get about a 2.5%. But it was more targeted, and I was thanked on the Senate floor for that work, for looking out for people that have committed themselves and are dedicated to doing a good job. They should be rewarded.
We have time for one last question after. Any other response?
KDOT, if we had stopped KDOT sweeps and fully funded capers this year, the tax increase would have been another $500 million. So we if you wanted to see another $500 million in taxes, we could have eliminated both of those things.
Yeah, there were other options out there. There was other money available. They just chose not to go there.
Well, and the reality is, there are people who voted this year and people who stood on the sidelines and said they weren't going to vote for anything. And if you're not going to vote for anything, you're not going to move the needle. And that's what we ran into, because there were, like I said earlier with the governor saying he wasn't going to sign anything, you know, talk to your representative and senator about whether they voted for these things, because it's not enough to say I fought for it. Did you get it done? Did you vote for it? And make it happen. And there's a difference. And we could have gotten some of those things, but we had people who kind of removed themselves from the process and said, I'm a no all the way along.
Yeah, with the issues and the struggles with rural health care, where's your position on Medicaid expansion? And I know it passed this year, but could not override the veto, and wondered where do you see it going?
We spent a significant amount of time at the last legislative coffee on Medicaid expansion. I don't want to retread all that ground at this point. I think that depending on what happens at the federal level, which obviously is still in a great state of flux right now, we'll have another conversation about Medicaid expansion closer to next session. I think it will look different than what you saw last year, which was about as open and expansive, if you pardon the terminology, an expansion as any state has done. And we're seeing some pushback in states like Oregon who are having problems with their expansion. So one of the things I will tell you as far as fighting for rural health care, both the $13 million for community mental health centers, and I supported the provider privilege fee reimbursement, which gave us the 4% Medicaid cut that had been made by the governor unilaterally a year ago. It restored that. That's $82.7 million into health care across this state. And that's something, when we talked about Medicaid expansion at that coffee, I said I would support, and I was proud to support that. And so we have put $82 million into hospitals and healthcare facilities across this state because of that vote. And I was proud to be a yes on that.
You know, one of the things that we need to make sure on the Medicaid expansion is, as the federal government looks at it, is that Kansas is not penalized for not going forward. We need to make sure that if they do come up with their block grants or whatever system they decide on, that Kansas is a part of the equation. And I've heard Senator Moran speak on that, and I know he's working on it. We need to reach out to our U.S. delegation and make sure that Kansas is not harmed in that decision.
1 minute. I don't know if I should pontificate or anything about really what it comes down to for me. When insurance isn't healthcare, our healthcare costs are just through the roof, and I know that the federal level is all in flux, and that's really the case. I agree with the senator that it can't come back and hurt Kansas for not having moved forward on that, but I really feel like we're up in the air right now with the federal level, and yeah, we'll have that conversation more.
Legislators, I want to give you just a couple minutes. Sorry, Matt. Didn't talk into the mic. I want to give you just a couple seconds, or actually a couple minutes, to kind of give your wrap-up and tell us about, the Senate Bill 30. I know we didn't discuss that, which was number 3 on your sheet that we had handed out. The tax bill that was passed, did you support that bill? Why or why not? Did you support the veto? Where were you at on that particular line item? And then also talking about, if you can roll into your final comments, and I know that Senator Tyson already discussed this, about what are your thoughts about the budget bill that gave our state employees a raise, of which they had not seen in years. So if you'd like to begin, Senator Tyson?
Oh, thank you. Thanks again for coming. This crowd's a lot quieter in the afternoon. So
it's the lemonade.
Yeah, there you go. Long day work. Yes, I am fully aware of the state employees, and we have some great employees out there. We have some great teachers out there, and the state legislature does not control the teachers' salaries. The locals do. But, what I could do for the state employees, I did. I spoke up and I stood up and made sure that the people that are committed that we're trying to take care of them. It's critical, and especially the Osawatomie State Hospital. I know I've been very vocal on that front, and I still will continue to. The governor's trying to privatize still. I have a feeling they might get that they're going to bring lobbyists around this summer to visit with people, which is very disappointing. As far as the Senate Bill 30, I did not support it. Like I said, I just could not. I could not vote against our constituency. People that are struggling, living check to check, trying to make ends meet. We could have put some stuff in there that would have helped them. The standard deductions, the sales tax on food, we could have looked out for our own. My philosophy, and I live by this, is yes, I am conservative, but we help those that cannot help themselves. So, as far as I'm concerned, this tax bill was a burden on lower individuals that are struggling each day to make ends meet. We did grow government. We grew it 1.6% with this tax bill and budget. But that being said, we did have it's a very contentious time in the legislature right now. The dynamics have changed. George could speak to this. He's such a bright face. I love when he's in the Capitol because he's always smiling, and we need more of that. But I would encourage you guys to get involved, to reach out, to come up to the Capitol, to watch the process, to help understand how it works and how it operates. And we've never had a more transparent government than we do now. The committee meetings are online. And next year we think that the Senate chamber is going to be video, not just audio, but video. So that's some good things that we're moving in the right direction on. We need that transparency. We don't want backroom deals. And I appreciate you guys and your comments and involvement. It's always good to hear from you.
Senator Tyson, just as a clarification, your initial vote on Senate Bill 30 was no, and then your veto?
I voted no on the bill, and I voted no on the veto override.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And that's another thing. Our voting record is completely transparent. I've always done it since I've been elected. In my updates, I always tell you how I voted on a bill. I always put it out there. But it's also online, or you can call us, or you can call Legislative Research or the Kansas State Library. They will tell you how we voted on a bill. I think you should know.
Yeah. Okay. Representative Jones.
And I'll go real quick back to the budget, being on appropriations. That's one of the things that was really eye-opening. We did, and probably the right way to do it too, because we brought some stuff forward for cuts within committee And if you guys saw it, it's not pretty. Plain and simple, it just wasn't pretty. I had some studies done to find out just to bring us to zero, what it would be with K-12, and this is without our debt, our debt payments and different things. You take stuff out or you keep it in. Debt service removed and K through 12 removed. It was like 5%, 5 to 6% overall. Cut across the board. We're talking we're talking everything. No, I'm sorry. With everything removed, it would have been a 11 to 12% across the board. And I know, having heard the colleges and stuff like that, you get into the 10% range on cuts for a budget. It's catastrophic almost. I mean, there's a lot of things that it will hit. If you take and keep everything in, talking K through 12, everything, and it's still a 5 or 6% across the board cut to bring us to zero. And so we ran a 3%, I think, and it literally got like 2 or 3 votes from us. So the cuts are a difficult thing to do. And if it's the focus of a legislature to really start bringing things in, removing different organizations that you have, it has to be the focus and intention to do that. And this year, I don't know that we had that or even close to that. But that being said, it was a mixed feeling year. It was a difficult year. Like I said to start, I did not necessarily see the end from the beginning, and I truly believe that we have the answer. Like it or not, we have the answer where we sit right now. And so coming into next year, it's going to set us up for an interesting year next year when it comes to budget and taxes and all of that. So.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out today. As far as the tax bill, Senate Bill 30, I voted no on the underlying bill when it came through. I had significant problems with the bill. I did vote yes on the override because at that point, the governor had evidenced and told a group of legislators that very day he was not going to sign anything. And the next plan was going to be bigger. And so that was one of those, all right, we'll take our medicine here so that we don't end up having an even bigger tax increase that burdens the public. And that's exactly where it was going if that override had failed. You talk about, I told you about $500 million for KDOT and Capers. There were people that had that plan ready to go. And you would have seen another $500 million in tax increase. As far as the budget, we did do some things to save money this year that didn't really get mentioned. They get kind of overlooked. We did the state contract for health insurance for K-12, which is estimated to save about $120 million over the next 2 years, and the joint purchasing for unified school districts, which is supposed to save about $16 million over the next 2 years. So there's about $136 million in cost savings just from those two things in trying to find some greater efficiencies, and I was happy to support those. We also, for the first time in our state's history next year, will use priority-based budgeting for some of our departments, where they will come in and say, here's the programs that we think the citizens want, and here's the cost to each of those programs, and we can then decide whether those programs justify the expense. And so I'm happy to see that we're going to take a look at doing something different rather than have people just come in and protect their turf. I was also happy to support, like I said, the tax plan that we ultimately didn't get, which included a lot of good things, including a smaller tax increase, included changing some sales tax exemptions, doing away with them, and having more people pay sales tax so that we could lower the rate overall. And unfortunately, that one didn't see the light of day, but that's kind of the way the session goes. You've got things that look like they're great ideas, and you're going somewhere, and they run into resistance, and so something else ends up happening. I will say that the tax plan that ultimately passed does restore all of those deductions. Property tax, mortgage interest, medical are all restored over the next 3 years to 100%. For property tax and mortgage interest, it goes 50, 75, 100. Medical is restored immediately, and the loss carry-forwards were part of almost every tax plan that we saw. So those are all on the other side of the ledger. They will help our folks. They will help folks who own homes and own real property, and they will see those deductions restored. I would say one of the things I'm most proud of that we didn't get to talk about and often don't get to talk about is the work of the Judiciary Committee. You talk about kind of the library within the legislature. If it's either us or Capers in terms of putting people to sleep. But we had several pieces of legislation this year, worked with my Senate colleague, Senator Wilborn, very well, and we increased public safety by fighting back against human trafficking, those who would commit burglaries and home invasions. We stiffened the penalties for both of those. We added the Law Enforcement Protection Act that the Attorney General championed, and we signed the same day the Law Enforcement Fallen Officers Memorial was updated this year, and the rotunda was packed with police officers and sheriff's deputies from around the state, and it was an honor to be a part of that and to have helped get that bill passed this year. We protected the innocent. For the first time, we will videotape or audio tape every custodial interrogation in a capital case, a murder or rape investigation, so that we can cut down on false positives, false convictions, and not put innocent people behind bars. We clarified the sexually violent predator program to help keep it constitutional, to keep those people from returning to our communities before they are ready to do so, and they have been certified to do so by professionals in the field. We worked to update the corporate code. We added something called the Public Benefit Corporation, which you don't hear a lot about, but if you know about the Patagonia Clothing Company, they're one of those public benefit corporations that uses some of their profits to go back into community service and do community good. And without this legislation, that would not be possible in Kansas without risking shareholder lawsuits. We increased collections for the state of Kansas, which ultimately helped reduce the tax burden on the public by making it easier to collect delinquent court costs and fees, something that has not been done in all cases in the past. And then we added transparency by clarifying the process for going into executive session. When public bodies go behind closed doors, you need to know as much about that as possible. And so we clarified that, as well as looking at the Kansas Open Records Act and the exemptions to those. So it was about 38 pieces of legislation total that the Judiciary Committee tackled this year, many at the request of our prosecutors, law enforcement, and the Attorney General, and I think we did a good job. I'm proud of that. You don't hear a lot about that, but know that a lot of us worked hard on those things too that are not the big sexy headlines about tax budget and school finance. So thank you all for coming out and being as interested. Many of your faces we see every month at these things, and it is an honor and a pleasure to serve you in Topeka, and I thank you for that. I don't take that lightly, and even when we disagree, I appreciate that many of you do so courteously and with respect, and try to understand why the decisions get made the way they do. Nobody up here likes to disappoint any of you, but the nature of our business is we have to press one light or the other. We have to say yay or nay. And that's not always easy to find the gray area in there and figure out where it is that we agree. But I thank you for your patience and your kindness and for allowing me to be your representative. Thank you.
Please help me in thanking our legislators for being here this afternoon. We appreciate you being here today. Again, Ottawa area young professionals, we did the moderating and provided the refreshments. City of Ottawa obviously provided this facility, and Matt Simonson is making this available to individuals and other citizens who are unable to be here at this time. So thank you, Matt. We appreciate it. As you all know, yay, Matt. Properties closer to that time. Please be safe and enjoy the 4th of July and the hallmark of our independence. Thank you.